I never thought my own son would betray me. After my wife passed away, I lived alone in the house I had built with my bare hands. My son, Daniel, often visited, pretending to care, but lately he'd been unusually interested in my property. One morning he surprised me with a trip. "Dad, you've been working all your life. Let me take you on vacation to Europe," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I hesitated, but the thought of spending time together after so long melted my doubts. I agreed. The flight was long, but I was excited until the nightmare began. When we landed, Daniel told me he needed to handle something at the counter. He walked away with my passport, my wallet, everything. I waited. 1 hour passed, then 2. I asked airport staff for help, but without ID, they could do nothing. I realized the truth. My son had abandoned me. Alone, broke, and stranded in a foreign country, I sat on the cold bench, my heart heavy with disbelief. Why would my own flesh and blood do this? That night, as I tried to sleep in the corner of the terminal, I overheard 2 travelers talking about a charity that helped stranded seniors. That conversation changed everything. I found help, a way home, and a plan. When Daniel returned to my house a week later, unlocking the door with a grin, he froze. I was sitting right there on the couch, waiting. I smiled and said, "Oh, you're back. I have a surprise for you." Daniel's face turned pale the moment he saw me sitting there. His keys slipped from his hand and clattered against the floor. "Dad, how are you here?" he stammered, his voice trembling. I looked straight into his eyes and smiled, a calm smile that carried the weight of betrayal and quiet victory. "Sit down, son," I said softly. "We need to talk." He hesitated, glancing toward the door as if considering running, but I gestured to the chair across from me. Slowly, he sat. For a moment, there was silence. Only the ticking of the clock between us filled the air. "You left me there, Daniel," I began. "No money, no documents, no phone. You wanted me gone so you could take this house, didn't you?" He swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the floor. "Dad, it's not like that." "Then tell me what it was like," I said, my tone sharper now. "Why would you do something so cruel to your own father?" He had no answer. I could see the guilt washing over him, but it was too late for excuses. I leaned back in my chair. "You want to know how I came back?" His head snapped up, confusion flashing across his face. "After you left me, I met a kind man named Robert. He was an American diplomat who saw me sitting alone at the airport. He helped me contact the embassy, and they arranged my documents. But that's not the interesting part." I paused. Robert was also an attorney. When I told him what happened, he offered to help me legally secure everything I own. So before you even stepped back into this house, the ownership papers were transferred to a foundation I created. Daniel's jaw dropped. "You what?" "That's right," I said. "This house, the business, the accounts, all under my foundation now. You can't touch a thing." He looked furious, his eyes narrowing. "You can't do this to me! I'm your son!" he shouted. I stood up, my calm returning. "No, Daniel, you did this to yourself. A son doesn't betray his father for a house." He sat in stunned silence, shaking his head, muttering under his breath. "You don't understand, Dad. I was drowning in debt. I didn't know what else to do." "Then you should have come to me, not tried to destroy me." Tears welled in his eyes. For the first time in years, I saw the little boy I once carried on my shoulders. "I'm sorry, Dad. I really am." I nodded slowly. "I believe you, son. But some lessons have to be learned the hard way." Just then there was a knock on the door. Daniel looked confused. "Who's that?" "That is your surprise," I said, my voice low but steady. When I opened the door, 2 officers stood there, alongside Robert. "Mr. Miller, we are here to discuss your attempted fraud and elder abuse charges." Daniel's face went white. "Dad, no, please," he begged. "I didn't mean—" But I stopped him. "You'll have your chance to explain. This isn't revenge, Daniel. It's justice." The officers took him gently but firmly by the arms and led him outside. I stood by the door, watching as the car pulled away. My heart felt heavy, but also strangely free. Weeks later, I received a letter from Daniel. He was in a rehabilitation program, working to rebuild his life. He wrote, "Dad, thank you for not giving up on me, even when I didn't deserve it. You showed me what real strength looks like." I smiled as I read his words. People can lose their way, but sometimes pain is the only thing that teaches us how to find it again. Now, every morning, I sit on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise. The world feels quieter, but also more peaceful. I know I've done what needed to be done, not out of anger, but out of love. And as I look toward the horizon, I whisper to myself, some surprises are meant to open eyes, not hearts.
Months passed after Daniel's arrest. I tried not to think about him, but no matter how much I convinced myself that he deserved what happened, a father's heart never stops caring. Every night, I'd glance at the empty chair across from mine at the dinner table and feel a sting of silence. One evening, Robert came by again. "He's doing better," he said. "The rehabilitation center is helping him reflect. He's even started volunteering." I nodded quietly, not trusting myself to speak. The next day, I received another letter. This one was longer. Daniel wrote about his therapy sessions, about how he'd finally faced the truth, that greed had blinded him, that he had tried to replace love with money. "Dad," he wrote, "you didn't just save yourself that day. You saved me from becoming someone even worse." That letter broke something inside me, and maybe it fixed something too. I decided to visit him. When I arrived at the rehabilitation center, Daniel was sitting on a bench, thinner, older, but softer somehow. When he saw me, he froze, then stood up, unsure of what to do. I took a step closer. "You can give your old man a hug, you know," I said. He smiled, tears filling his eyes, and hugged me like he hadn't done in years. "I'm so sorry, Dad," he whispered. "I know," I said quietly, patting his back. "Let's move forward from here." From that day, things slowly changed. Daniel stayed at the center for another few months, finishing his program. I visited every weekend. We'd sit and talk about life, about his mother, about the mistakes we both made. It wasn't easy. He had to rebuild trust, and I had to learn to forgive. But step by step, we did. When he was finally released, I didn't take him home right away. Instead, I took him to the small local shelter where Robert volunteered. "If you want to rebuild your life," I said, "start by helping others rebuild theirs." Daniel nodded, understanding. He spent months there, cooking for the homeless, helping elderly people with groceries, teaching kids basic computer skills. Slowly, the man who once betrayed me became someone I was proud of again. One rainy afternoon, he came to me holding a stack of papers. "Dad," he said nervously, "this is for you." I looked at the documents. He had created a new nonprofit organization in my late wife's name. "It's called Grace Home Foundation," he said. "It's for elderly people who have no one. I want to give them what I took from you: safety, family, dignity." My chest tightened and I couldn't stop the tears this time. "You've done more than enough, son," I said. "Mom would be proud." A year later, the foundation grew. Daniel ran it full-time, and I became the honorary chairman. Reporters even came to interview him about his second chance story. When they asked him how it all began, he smiled and said, "My father gave me a surprise once, and it changed my life." Now, every morning, we sit together on that same porch. 2 mugs of coffee between us. No secrets, no anger, no distance. Just the soft hum of peace. Sometimes he looks at me and says, "Dad, thank you for not giving up on me." And every time I answer, "That's what fathers do, son. They wait for their children to find their way back home."
The following year brought more change than I could have imagined. Grace Home Foundation began as a small idea, but word spread fast. People from across the country started sending letters, donations, and even volunteers. Some came with stories just like mine: parents abandoned, forgotten, left behind. Daniel worked day and night, never complaining, never resting. I often caught him sitting with the residents, listening to their stories, holding their hands like he was trying to heal every wound he once caused. One evening, I walked into his office. He was staring at an old photograph of his mother. "I miss her every day," he said softly. "She would have loved this place." I nodded. "She would have been proud of you, son." For a moment, we both just sat there in silence, the kind that feels full instead of empty. A few months later, something unexpected happened. A major news channel wanted to feature Grace Home in a national segment called The Heart of America. When the reporter arrived, she interviewed me first. "Mr. Miller," she asked, "how does it feel to see your son transform from betrayal to compassion?" I smiled faintly. "It feels like watching winter turn into spring," I said. "Cold doesn't disappear in a day, but when it does, you realize the warmth was always waiting." Then she turned to Daniel. "What inspired you to start all this?" He looked at me before answering. "My father once said, 'A surprise can open your eyes.' That surprise saved me. So now, I want to be that surprise for others." The story went viral. Donations flooded in, and soon Grace Home expanded to 3 new states. A local business offered to donate land for a new senior living center, and Daniel was asked to speak at several universities about forgiveness and redemption. Watching him stand on stage, confident yet humble, I felt a deep peace settle in my chest. I thought of that day at the airport, the cold floor beneath me, the ache of betrayal, and I realized that pain had led us here. Sometimes the hardest moments are the seeds of the most beautiful ones. One night, as I sat on the porch, Daniel joined me quietly. He handed me a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" I asked. "It's my official resignation from the foundation," he said. My heart skipped. "You're leaving?" He shook his head. "Not leaving, Dad. Expanding. I've been invited to Washington to help design a national program for elderly care. Grace Home will continue, but I'll be working on something bigger, something that reaches thousands." I stared at him for a long time, pride swelling in my chest. I said, "Your mother would have called that a miracle." "No, Dad," he replied with a gentle smile. "She would have called it your surprise." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how life had turned full circle, from betrayal to forgiveness, from loss to purpose. I realized that maybe this was the real surprise all along. Not that I survived, not that I got justice, but that I got my son back, better than ever.
Years passed. Daniel's work grew beyond anything either of us dreamed. Grace Home became a symbol of compassion, a place where no elderly person felt forgotten. But time, as always, kept moving. My health started to fade. Simple walks left me breathless, and nights felt longer. Daniel visited whenever he could, though his new responsibilities in Washington kept him busy. One evening, he came home unexpectedly. "Dad," he said, his eyes bright but tired, "I've been invited to receive an award, the Presidential Medal for Community Service, but I want you to be there when I get it." I smiled weakly. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, son." He held my hand tight, like a child again. "You started all of this, Dad. You were my first teacher." The day of the ceremony came. The hall was filled with people, leaders, journalists, volunteers. When Daniel walked on stage, the crowd erupted in applause. He accepted the medal and then turned to the microphone. "I want to dedicate this to someone very special," he said, his voice trembling. "My father. Years ago, I made a terrible mistake. I left him alone when he needed me most, but instead of hatred, he gave me love. Instead of punishment, he gave me a second chance. He's the reason I stand here today." Cameras turned toward me. I couldn't hold back my tears as Daniel walked off stage and hugged me tightly. "That's the best surprise yet," I whispered, and the audience stood up, clapping until the hall echoed. After the ceremony, we returned home together. The porch, the same old chairs, the same sunset. Daniel looked at me and said, "Dad, I'm building something new. A national retirement village network in your name. It'll be called the Miller Homes." I was speechless. "You've given so much already, Daniel," I said softly. "Because you gave me everything first," he replied. That night, as I watched him plan and dream, I realized something profound. Life always gives us a chance to rewrite our story, if only we have the courage to turn the page. Weeks later, I fell ill and had to be hospitalized. Daniel never left my side. Every morning, he'd sit by my bed, reading letters from people whose lives our foundation had changed. One morning, I said, "Daniel, promise me something." He leaned closer. "Anything, Dad. Promise to keep surprising people, with kindness, with forgiveness, with love." He nodded, his eyes glassy. "Always." Months after I returned home, we inaugurated the first Miller home. Hundreds of elderly residents moved in, their laughter filling the air. As Daniel gave his opening speech, I stood quietly in the crowd, my heart overflowing. He said, "This isn't just my father's legacy. It's a reminder that love can rebuild even the most broken hearts." The audience rose again, clapping, some crying. I looked up at the sky, whispering to my late wife, "He's finally home." That night, sitting on the porch, Daniel beside me, I thought about the long road we'd traveled, from betrayal and heartbreak to forgiveness and peace. "You know, Dad," he said softly, "the day you said I had a surprise for you, I thought it would be something small. I didn't know it would change my whole life." I smiled, resting my hand on his shoulder. "That's the thing about surprises, son. They don't end, they grow."
Seasons changed, and so did our lives. The Miller Homes became a name people spoke with warmth and pride. Every new branch opened with laughter, stories, and second chances. I watched from my porch, no longer the lonely man abandoned in a foreign country, but a father who had lived long enough to see his son become the man he was meant to be. Daniel's visits became more frequent again, despite his work. He'd bring files, ideas, and stories from every home he visited. "Dad,"
he'd say, sitting beside me with coffee. "You should see them, the smiles, the hope. Some of them call me son." I'd chuckle. "Well, I guess I have to share you now." He laughed too, but his eyes always softened when he looked at me. One afternoon, we received a letter from a small town in Texas. A woman named Margaret wrote, "Your foundation saved my father's life. He said Daniel reminded him of the son he lost years ago. Thank you for giving me back a piece of my family." I remember Daniel reading it aloud, his voice trembling slightly. He folded the letter and said, "Dad, it feels like everything I once broke is finally healing." I placed my hand over his. "That's what redemption feels like, son." A few months later, Daniel invited me to the annual gala of the foundation. It was being held in a huge ballroom filled with lights, photographs of the residents, and banners with our motto, "Every heart deserves a home." When I walked in, everyone stood and applauded. I wasn't used to attention, so I smiled shyly. Daniel took the stage. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate not just our achievements, but the man who made them possible. Years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life, but that mistake turned into a miracle because of my father's forgiveness." He paused, his eyes finding mine in the crowd. "Dad, this night is for you." The audience turned toward me, clapping, cheering. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My heart swelled with pride and my eyes filled with tears I didn't even try to hide. Then Daniel did something I never expected. He unveiled a large framed portrait, a painting of me, sitting on the porch, cup of coffee in hand, the sunrise behind me. Below it was a plaque that read, "The man who taught the world that forgiveness can build empires." My vision blurred as Daniel came down from the stage and hugged me tightly. "You're my hero, Dad. Always have been." After the event, we drove home in silence, both lost in our thoughts. When we reached the porch, Daniel broke the silence. He said, "You know, I used to think success meant money, fame, control, but now I realize it's peace, and you gave me that." I smiled. "No, son, you found it yourself. I just showed you where to look." We sat there for hours, the night cool and quiet, crickets chirping softly. It felt like time had finally stopped chasing us. A few weeks later, Daniel came to me with another surprise. "Dad, I want to start a scholarship fund for kids who've lost their parents or live alone. It'll help them study social work, nursing, or any field that helps others. I want to call it the Second Chance Scholarship." I couldn't help but laugh through my tears. "You've turned surprises into a lifestyle," I said. "Guess I learned from the best." He laughed too, but his eyes always softened when he looked at me. Life felt complete. The boy who once abandoned me now spent his life saving others. I knew then that every heartbreak, every sleepless night, every tear had a purpose. Pain had been our teacher, love our healer, and forgiveness our bridge back to each other. Years passed quietly. The air around our home felt lighter, warmer, almost sacred. Daniel's foundation had touched thousands of lives across the country. Everywhere he went, people recognized him, not as a man of power, but as a man of compassion. I often watched him on television, giving speeches about forgiveness and second chances. Every time I heard him say the words, "My father taught me that love is stronger than pride," my eyes would fill with tears. Life had come full circle. But time was catching up with me. My body was slower now, my breath shorter, yet my heart felt fuller than it ever had. One late autumn evening, the wind was crisp, leaves rustling softly outside. I sat by the window with a blanket over my legs, sipping tea. Daniel walked in, carrying 2 mugs of coffee, just like old times. "Dad, guess what?" he said, smiling wide. "The government just approved the Miller Homes expansion into 10 new states." I laughed softly. "That's wonderful, son." He sat beside me, his excitement glowing. "You should have been there for the meeting. Everyone kept mentioning your name. They said your story is what inspired the whole movement." I looked at him, pride and tenderness mixing in my chest. "You made sure of that," I said. We sat quietly for a while, watching the sunset turn gold and crimson. Then Daniel spoke again, his tone softer. "Dad, I've been thinking. You've given me everything, life, love, forgiveness, but I never got to give you something back." I chuckled. "You've already given me more than enough, son." He shook his head. "No, Dad, not yet." He reached into his coat pocket and handed me a small box. Inside was a golden key, engraved with my name. "What's this?" I asked, confused. He smiled. "It's for a special place we built, a retirement home named Miller Haven. It's peaceful, beautiful, by the lake. It's for people who gave their lives to helping others. You'll always have a home there, Dad." Tears burned in my eyes. "You built me a home?" I whispered. Daniel nodded, eyes glistening. "You built me a life, Dad. I just returned the favor." I couldn't speak for a long moment. I reached out and held his hand tight. "Promise me one thing," I said finally. "When I'm gone, you'll keep this place running with love. Not for money, not for fame, but for people." He smiled. "Always, I promise." That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked out to the porch one last time, the moonlight painting the yard silver. I thought about our journey, from that airport floor to this porch filled with peace. The world had changed, and so had we. I whispered into the cool night air, "Thank you, life, for giving me back my son." Weeks later, Daniel took me to see Miller Haven. It was breathtaking. Green gardens, laughter echoing from every corner, people smiling, knitting, reading, living without fear of loneliness. He walked beside me, proudly showing every room. "This is your legacy, Dad," he said quietly. I turned to him and smiled. "No, son, this is our legacy."
Winter came early that year. The mornings were colder, quieter. I could feel my strength fading, but strangely, I wasn't afraid. My heart was calm, because I had seen everything I needed to see. Daniel came every morning without fail, bringing coffee, blankets, and that same hopeful smile. He would sit beside me, talking about new projects, about the residents at Miller Haven, about the laughter echoing in those halls. I'd listen quietly, sometimes closing my eyes, just to hear the pride in his voice. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. One morning, as sunlight spilled through the window, I handed Daniel a sealed envelope. "Dad, what's this?" he asked. I smiled faintly. "A surprise," I said softly. "You'll open it when the time feels right." He frowned, sensing something in my tone, but I just squeezed his hand. "Don't worry, son. Some surprises take time to understand." Days turned into weeks, and my body grew weaker. I spent most of my time in bed, but Daniel never left my side. Every evening he'd read me stories, letters from people helped by our foundation, thank you notes, words of love and gratitude. Sometimes he'd stop reading halfway, too choked with emotion to continue. I'd smile weakly and whisper, "Keep going, son. The world needs to hear this." One evening, as the sky blushed with the colors of dusk, I felt my breath grow shallow. Daniel sat beside me, holding my hand tightly. "Dad," he whispered, "I'm right here." I opened my eyes slowly and smiled. "You made me proud, son. You made your mother proud, too." His tears fell silently. "Don't talk like that, Dad. We still have time." I shook my head gently. We already had all the time we needed. He bent forward, pressing his forehead to my hand. I love you, Dad. I love you too, Daniel, my voice fading into a soft breath. Always. That night, I drifted into sleep and never woke again. The next morning, Daniel sat in silence beside my bed. The world outside was quiet, as if even nature was holding its breath. After a while, he remembered the envelope I'd given him. With trembling hands, he opened it. Inside was a single handwritten letter. It read, "My dear son, if you're reading this, it means my journey has ended, but yours is still going. Don't grieve for me. You gave me more joy than I ever dreamed possible. You turned pain into purpose, loss into love. Keep building, keep forgiving, keep surprising the world with kindness. Remember, the true legacy of a man isn't the house he leaves behind, it's the hearts he heals. You've healed mine. Love, Dad." Daniel pressed the letter to his chest, tears streaming down his face. Then he looked out the window, where the morning sun rose, golden and gentle. "I'll keep your promise, Dad," he whispered. "Every day, I'll keep it." Months later, Miller Haven built a memorial garden called the Father's Porch. At its center stood a bronze statue of a man holding a coffee mug, looking toward the sunrise. A plaque beneath it read, "In memory of those who turned forgiveness into forever." Every year on the same date, Daniel would sit on that bench, cup of coffee in hand, smiling through tears. And sometimes, when the wind blew softly through the trees, he swore he could hear his father's voice whisper, "That's the thing about surprises, son. They never really end."
3 years later, a crisp autumn morning dawned at Miller Haven. The air carried the faint smell of coffee and blooming jasmines, the same scent Daniel remembered from his father's porch. Life had moved on, but his father's words still guided him like a compass. He had expanded the foundation, building new homes in memory of fathers and mothers who'd been left behind, just like his own once was. Each home bore a nameplate that read, "A Promise Kept." That day, Miller Haven was hosting an annual gathering for families. Children laughed, elderly residents smiled, and volunteers busied themselves with decorations. As Daniel walked through the garden, everyone greeted him with warmth, but his eyes stopped at the statue. His father's likeness, cast in bronze, holding a coffee mug. For a moment, Daniel just stood there, his heart heavy and light all at once. A young boy, no more than 10, tugged at his sleeve. "Sir," he said shyly, "is that your dad?" Daniel knelt, smiling gently. "Yes," he replied softly. "He's the reason all of this exists." The boy nodded, his eyes wide. "My grandpa lives here now. He says your dad was a good man." Daniel's throat tightened. He was the best. As the boy ran off, Daniel looked up at the sunrise. It painted the sky in gold, exactly like that morning years ago, when his father's letter changed everything. He took a deep breath, then whispered with a trembling smile, "You were right, Dad. Some surprises really never end." And for a brief second, the wind stirred again, brushing his cheek like a familiar hand, warm, gentle, eternal. The camera slowly pans upward toward the statue, sunlight flaring behind it as serene piano music fades in. Then a voice narrates softly,